Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our participants and attendees from across the land, I'm imagining. I'm Jan Martinez. I'm director of the Martin Daniel Gould Center for Conflict Resolution here at Stanford Law School. And we want to start first with an acknowledgement of our land. Stanford sits on the ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. Welcome. We are delighted to have you here. The Stanford Law School, the Gould Center, and the Black Law Students Association welcome you. And today is the first in a series of 3 events conceived and organized by Ohio State University's Moritz School of Law and their Divided Community Project, along with the Journal on Dispute Resolution and the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program and Stanford. So we're thinking in coordinating this effort together in this first series. And so we are delighted to have you join us. Rethinking Systems Design for Racial Justice and Equity. As you can imagine, we had a negotiation over the title of what we are about, but this really was an effort to pause and assess the perspectives from a number of experiences across the country. By systems, sounds like an engineering term, we seek to capture the diverse efforts across the Bay Area, California, and the United States, and drawing from the perspective of practitioners, activists, scholars, practitioners, and in terms of design, we're trying to compare the goals that each of these initiatives sets for themselves, the processes of engagement, the stakeholders that are involved, the resources that are available to make the effort successful, and what are the metrics for success and evaluation. So today we have 2 panels. The first is moderated by my colleague, Justin Bryant. It features 6 leaders participating in truth and reconciliation efforts across the Bay Area and across California. Panel 2 is going to be moderated by Gran Lum and Carrie McClelland. It features 7 authors live who will address reconciliation efforts across the country. So I'm going to turn over now to Justin to launch us with the first panel.
Thank you so much, Jan, and good morning to our audience across the country, and good morning to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today on what is sure to be a very rewarding and rich conversation. I want to get right into things so that we have the maximum amount of time to talk about this important work. And so here we have represented, as Jan mentioned, 6 practitioners representing 4 initiatives across California that are doing amazing work in reconciliation and reparations. And so right away, I will go ahead and introduce our representatives from the San Francisco Human Rights Commission and the African American Reparations Advisory Committee. Dr. Cheryl Davis is the executive director of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission and previously served as commissioner between 2011 and 2016. And Eric McDonald is the chairman of the San Francisco African American Reparations Advisory Committee. And the Human Rights Commission is focused on addressing racial injustice broadly, but the advisory committee is charged with researching, preparing, and presenting a proposed plan for reparations based on the harm experienced by Blacks in the Black community sanctioned by the city. And the Human Rights Commission is also supporting the development of a Truth and Healing Committee for the American Indian community and aim to amplify community voices in developing and implementing solutions. And I'll also go off and say that the bios of our panelists here are so extensive and so impressive, and I will not be able to get to all of their accomplishments, but they are on the conference website if you wish to dig deeper. So moving on to the San Francisco Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, we have Dr. Fania Davis, who's a consultant for the commission, as well as an author, civil rights attorney, and leading international voice on the intersections of racial and restorative justice. And her initiative, the San Francisco Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, is part of a larger initiative by the National Grassroots Law Project to reckon with systemic harm against Black people in the cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. While district attorneys are leading the initiatives in Boston and Philadelphia, San Francisco is different in that the district attorney is power sharing with the community, and the San Francisco Human Rights Commission is co-leading this work. The commission's purpose is to discover and detail oral histories, public histories, policies, laws, and the overall playbook of Black disinvestment in San Francisco from 1970 to 2022. They are investigating how multiple systems have conspired to essentially cause the disappearance of San Francisco's Black community. And this will be done with an eye towards how these dynamics echo across the country. Thank you for being here, Dr. Davis. Dr. Cheryl Grills is a clinical psychologist and full professor at Loyola Marymount University, where she is director of its Psychology Applied Research Center. And Don Tamaki is senior counsel and former managing partner of Minami Tamaki LLP, largely known for his historic work serving on the pro bono legal team that reopened the landmark Supreme case of Korematsu versus the United States. And together they are our representatives for the California Task Force to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. And the task force is established pursuant to California Assembly Bill 3121. And its purpose is to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans, to recommend appropriate ways to educate the California public of the task force's findings, and to recommend appropriate remedies in consideration of the task force's findings. And they will be issuing a report in two parts, the first part to be issued this June and the second part to be issued next June. And so thank you both for being here. Next, we have a representative from the California Truth and Healing Council. Dr. Kusla Kessler-Mata is an associate professor in the politics department of the University of San Francisco, and she previously worked for the California Indian Legal Services and the National Congress of American Indians. The California Truth and Healing Council was created through an executive order signed by Governor Newsom in 2019. The council's charge is to document the historical relationship between the state and California's Native Americans by examining existing records and receiving testimony from the California's Indian communities throughout the state. The council is comprised of individuals nominated by their tribal governments and appointed by the governor, and the council is designed to reflect the geographical, cultural, and political diversity of the tribes in the state. They will make recommendations to the governor in 2025. It's based on the principle that tribes are sovereign peoples, and the council has indicated an interest in pursuing restitution and land, and is not centering its work on reparations. Dr. Mata, thank you for being here as well. First off, so excited to begin this discussion. I'd love to give each of you 5 minutes to hear about the work that you've been doing as part of your initiative, and what is particularly pressing at this time. And I want to start out with Cheryl and Dawn to hear about the work that is being done on the state level.
So Dawn, I'll let you start, and then I'll follow you. Can't hear you.
I was going to let you start so I don't step on your lines. So really appreciate this symposium, and Stanford and the Ohio State, University of Ohio Divided Communities Project and the other sponsors, and of course the esteemed panel. Thank you so much for inviting us. So basically the task force was formed by legislation in 2020. Our first meetings were in July, public hearings, and Member Grills will be talking about that. The overall goal of the task force and its deliverables, I'll just summarize. So the following the George Floyd murder, May 26, 2020, and calls for racial reckoning in protests that were the largest in American history, and not just in the US, but worldwide. The legislature, through the efforts of advocacy groups, and Shirley Weber, now Secretary of State, passed AB 3121. And its purpose is basically to connect the dots in a way that hadn't been done so before, between the institution of slavery through Jim Crow, through separate but equal, through redlining, through freeways and highways that have destroyed communities, covering racial violence, and so on. And Member Grills is going to talk about the report that we're going to render, issue in June, but basically connecting the dots between the past and the present to indicate basically the through line that what we are seeing today and the consequences that we're seeing should not be a surprise. They're the logical outcome of layer after layer of discrimination. And I have to say that in shining a light on all that in that kind of way, it explains a lot about systems of discrimination in general, because the commodification of human beings on the basis of their skin color, in this case, African Americans being Black, and causing it to be generational enslavement and chattel property, says a lot about how other groups were treated: Asian Americans, Native people, Latinx, and so on. And once you can treat one group in such a way, horrifically, it's pretty easy that the others will also fall into categories throughout American history. So that's the first purpose. The second purpose is to render a report, and Cheryl will talk about the contents of that in part one, which is coming out in June. And then in June of 2023, the task force is charged with identifying what reparations is, defining it, who the eligible class that should be compensated, how it's to be calculated, and so on. It's obviously extremely daunting. Part one of the report is being done in June, and then in June of 2023 is the second part, and we're just beginning to discuss that second part. We've had 7 public hearings today. There's lots of expert testimony that's been given. I think even those who are steeped in this history will find it an eye-opener. I thought I knew personally something about American history, and far from it. Really, this history and record is so buried and so erased and so subject to willful amnesia that I think it will be, the report one at least, will be a huge contribution to the scholarship here. I think lastly, we hope that our effort will be replicated in other locales, in other regions. California is the first and only state to take this step so far. There hasn't been much movement on the national level to deal with this national problem. Government sanctioned separation and discrimination. And so locales and regions are taking this thing up. So I'm hoping that the materials we produce will be usable by the other groups in order to build the beginnings of a movement. Let me turn it over to Cheryl to tell you the details of the task force.
Thank you, Don, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So I'll be very brief. I want to touch on just 3 things. One is the report that will be coming out in June, our first of 2 reports. Secondly, the listening sessions that we will be engaging in as part of a community engagement effort. And then third, our communications strategy. So in terms of the report, much of our work up to this point has been a kind of a fact-finding mission to uncover the harms across a plethora of categories. And so now this report, which is 13 chapters long, over 500 pages, and counting, is identifying those harms according to several categories. And so aside from the first chapter, which is an introduction, the subsequent chapters in this report are going to cover the period of enslavement. And people really don't have an idea of just how cruel and vicious and heinous and mean-spirited and violent physically and psychologically and spiritually enslavement was. And so we hope to be able to convey some of that. The third chapter is going to address the issue of racial terror that emerges out of that system and that it continues to the present day. Fourth chapter is going to look at political disenfranchisement. The fifth chapter is going to be looking at the housing segregation and the multiple examples in California of the decimation of entire Black neighborhoods and communities. The sixth chapter will look at separate and unequal education. Chapter 7, racism in the environment and in infrastructure. The 8th chapter, the pathologizing of the Black family. The 9th chapter is going to look at control over the spiritual, creative, and cultural life of Black people. The next chapter, 10, is going to look at stolen labor and hindered opportunities. The 11th chapter, the unjust legal system. The 12th chapter, harm and neglect in the form of mental, physical, and public health. And then the 13th and final chapter will look at the wealth gap. And again, kind of like Dawn, I thought I knew a lot. This is my life's work. As a psychologist, I'm steeped in history because you really can't understand present behavior if you don't understand its historical backdrop. And I still learned a lot. And quite frankly, as we are pouring through this, it's gotten me to a state of feeling very sad because the pain is still very real and it's still affecting us to this day. So moving on then, we wanted to make sure that we had robust community engagement, that we understood what was the perspective of our community across different sectors, different constituencies within the Black community, particularly in California. And so these listening sessions are something that we came up with a design, and then we asked the Ralph Bunche Center at UCLA to actually oversee and implement these listening sessions that are led by 7 what we call anchor organizations. An anchor organization is a statewide or deep regional rooted organization with members and or affiliates in multiple areas of the state, and whose affiliates will function as tier 2 organizations. They're boots on the ground that can help to mobilize communities to come out and share their insights, their concerns, their wants and desires as it relates to reparations and the ongoing harms that we face in the Black community. Each of these anchor organizations has a network of anywhere from 8 to 30 plus organizations that they are in constant collaboration with. And they reflect a variety of sections of the state: Northern California, Southern California, Inland Empire, et cetera. What do we want to hear from these listening sessions? We want the stories of harm that people have in their family history and presently. We want to know what people think about the idea of reparations for Black people. We want to know what their thoughts are on what the forms of reparations should look like. And finally, who should receive reparations. Lastly, I'll say that we have a communication strategy that parallels the community engagement process. We hired through the Bunche Center 2 communications firms, AB Partners and Young Communications, and they are responsible for helping to educate the public about this reparations task force and its work, to promote information out there into the community in advance of every listening session, to gather the information and the stories. We'll have portals where people can go outside of a listening session and tell their family stories of harm, something that can be archived for future generations. And then to synthesize all of the information to help inform the task force on how best to inform and respond to media requests. So that's a really kind of fast overview, but I think in the service of time, I will turn it back to our leader over here.
Thank you, Don and Cheryl. Very much appreciate your commentary and look forward to circling back in further questions. Kusla, would love to hear about the California Truth and Healing Council and the latest with your initiative.
Sure. Thanks, Justin. And thanks also again for organizing this event. And for inviting us, right? So I'm working with the California Truth and Healing Council for the state. It's organized a little bit differently. I live in Ohlone territory up here in San Francisco, but my tribe that I'm representing is the Yaktichu Yaktilhini tribe from the Chumash area in Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo County, right, so down south. So I'm a representative of a region that is not presently where I live. There's a lot of really interesting ways in which our council is formed. It's through the executive branch, right, which I think is the first most distinctive aspect of it. The executive branch typically, right, at the federal level is where Indian tribal relations happen, right? Because of the president's treaty-making power. States have kind of replicated this, right? So states also have offices of tribal relations, and those are almost always under executive branches as well. What that means, right, so is that when Governor Newsom issued his apology in 2019 with executive order in 1519, right, acknowledging and apologizing on behalf of the state for the historical violence, exploitation, dispossession, and attempted destruction of tribal communities, he also established the California Truth and Healing Council as a path forward, right? So our council has 12 individuals representing, as I am, a geographic region. We're split into 4 different geographic regions that kind of represent cultural differences, but to be quite honest, right, there's many different ways that you could slice up that pie in California. There are over 109 federally recognized tribes, right? 171 total tribes on the list that California maintains of California Native Americans. So we're talking about quite a large number of communities that are implicated in the work of the council. One of the aspects that I have to bring up is that because we're under the executive branch, we also are tied to the governor's funding streams, right? So we are authorized for about $150,000 a year to do our work until the year 2025. That's not a lot, right? The council members are, of course, not compensated for anything other than the time that we meet. And our work in community, it's really important, I think, that we compensate those people that are participating with us and make sure that they're not bearing the burden of providing their testimony to the state. So we've got our challenges set out for us with regards to funding and sustaining the project. We did receive an increase for this year, which is greatly appreciated, thanks to the budget surplus. And we hope to continue partnering with funding partners such as Decolonizing Wealth in order to move forward with our plans. So it's becoming a public-private partnership to some extent as well, which is a bit unique. I want to mention some of the guiding principles of the council, right? So we're California Native-led, right? So it must be Native-led, directed, and informed by California Native Americans to account for the history, right? We're consultation informed. Now, what that means, right, is that there's a consultation process in addition to the work of the council, where the Office of the Tribal Advisor is directly engaging tribes in their capacity as such, right, as governments. So the governor's office is individually meeting with tribal governments to hear from them how they want their own history reflected in this process, and also finding out what their needs are in order to support them to participate in the process. It's generally speaking, right, community driven. So we are aiming to be both inclusive of the 171 tribal communities, as also to reflect their recommendations for the remedies and to accurately represent the harms that they are presenting them. And then, of course, our goal is to aim for real and equitable outcomes. So the work of the council must drive toward outcomes and remedial change for California Native Americans using principles of equity. Equity being a really, interesting buzz term, I really think of it in this case as, residual ownership, right, of the land and all that's grown out of it in these preceding years. Now, mind you, that's my own opinion. So the facts that I present about the council are not, synonymous with the decisions of the council or their positions. They're mine entirely. But most importantly, at least from my perspective, as I sit on one of the subcommittees for the council, the academic subcommittee, is that all of our work that's done with tribal communities throughout the state is done with respect and protection of Native American intellectual and cultural property rights. So we're trying to utilize free, prior, informed consent model in our engagements. And that, it's a very interesting and big conversation that has to happen around that. Because of course, any documents you turn over to the state can be subject to FOIA and so forth. So we're trying to think about how to protect tribal information, right, that they do not necessarily want made broadly available. Last, I just want to note a couple of things, right? We have listening sessions that are open to the public. So far, they've mostly been through Zoom, unfortunately. We are going to be trying to go out into community starting next month by prioritizing, the tribes in the region where we're going to be attending. We have regular meetings and subcommittee meetings and so forth. But all of this is really aimed to creating the structure for correcting the historical record. Most folks are, talk about not understanding the history, right? Most folks don't even think they know the history, right? And so we're working with a blank slate for the most part across the state. It makes it complicated, right? The state historically endorsed and funded the genocide and removal of California Native Americans. Most folks don't realize that there were 18 negotiated treaties that were never ratified by the Senate. This would have designated 8.5 million acres of what we now know to be California for Native people. Those treaties were not ratified, and the reasons were largely because the California state legislature, right, and business interests didn't want them to be. So when they got to the Senate, they were put under wraps, right, until the early 1900s. So this meant also that we had a phenomenon of the homeless Indians of California, right? Because the signatory tribes no longer had anywhere to go. They were removed from their ancestral territories and then were not allowed to go to, because the treaties weren't ratified, they were not designated new land, right? So this creates also another kind of challenge up and down, especially coastal California. What makes both reparative and restorative concepts of justice, I think, unique for both Indigenous and Black populations is that this existence of ongoing harms, right, centuries after the initial damage, implicates a much broader whole of society responsibility for redress. So those that have built their lives here in the great state of California have also inherited the liability of our history. So the ones who have caused the damage are not the only ones with the duty to compensate for them. So that's kind of where we find ourselves, and it's difficult terrain to navigate, but I'm thankful for this opportunity to share our thoughts, Justin.
And thank you for sharing, Kusal. Really appreciate it. Cheryl and Eric would love to now focus on San Francisco and the efforts happening in the city with the Human Rights Commission and the African American Reparations Advisory Committee. Please take it away.
Great, thank you. I'll get us started and then I will pass it over to Eric, to Chair McDonald. So I want to echo what others have said, just really grateful to be in space here. I think Kusla is the only one that I need to make sure that I follow up with after this engagement. Others we've kind of talked, because I think where we are is that, what I appreciate about the work that's happening is that Don and Cheryl have done this work on the statewide level, but very focused, right, on the state, and that what we're doing in San Francisco is hyper local, right? So when folks are talking, so some of the issues and challenges that I think the statewide initiative faces, we don't have to deal with because we're so focused, narrowly focused on San Francisco. And even when we start to think about the who in that, it's going to have some kind of connectivity to San Francisco in some way. I imagine, I believe. because of some of the things that Kusla was mentioning in terms of redevelopment agency, in terms of environmental justice efforts, because what we're finding with 209 standing, Prop 209, that limits the use of being able to focus in on race. What we're finding is if we're going to talk about redress, it's going to have to be connected to something very specific. And so those pieces, that is a challenge. And I think, you know, I listened to Kusla talk about the regional approach and the challenges even here in San Francisco for the Ohlone in terms of how they're recognized and how they're represented and what that looks like. So there are challenges even when we start to think about hyperlocal and how it fits into the regional, how it fits into the state, how it fits into the national. So sorry about that. Yes. So one of the things I think for me has been interesting is that as we talk about the work and how we move the work, how do we build allyship and that we are not in competition, right? And so it's interesting to think about, you know, the enslavement of Black people, but that the land was initially taken from the original inhabitants, right? And so how are we doing this in a way that is mindful, but also to this point of understanding the continued harms, right? That it wasn't in isolation and that it has been perpetuated. So we're in this place right now where San Francisco is now beginning the process for Truth and Healing for in partnership with the American Indian Cultural District here in San Francisco, really modeled after the process that we did for the African American Reparations Advisory Committee. And so that is a 15-member body. That body was selected by the Board of Supervisors, but it was a community process. There were people had to submit their applications. They had to go before this public body. They had to kind of express themselves. But even before that, there was a community process that was used. And so having, you know, these conversations with Fania around truth and reconciliation and with James Bell and what that looks like, we also are trying to be really mindful of how not to duplicate efforts. So I appreciated Cheryl saying that her lifelong work and is still learning new things, right? Because I think a lot of times what we hear from folks is, we've done this, we've answered these questions, you've already talked to us, why are you still doing this research? And I think that the need to uncover and learn more is something that I will take back, because we do kind of hit this. And I think that, you know, Fania and the folks she's working with have tried to be really intentional about not duplicating efforts, not overtaxing community with asking current community the same questions 20 times, but that we do want to actually get to the data that has never really been unearthed or that has never been highlighted. And as we begin to do this work, it's awesome to have partners and allies or accomplices, or yesterday in conversation with Cornel West, he was like, folks who stand in solidarity with, right? And that's why I think, you know, it's interesting to have Don be the one non-Black person on the statewide reparations task force to actually bring in and to have those conversations and be the advocate. So as we're building out here in San Francisco, you know, first with the Reparations Advisory Committee, which African American Reparations Advisory Committee, which Eric can share more about. And as we use that to model and think about what does that look like for what we do with the Truth and Healing focused on the American Indian community, we also in the Human Rights Commission hold the Office of Racial Equity, which looks at this work citywide, right? And how are we doing it internally? How is it received externally? And I think those are the challenges that when we do this work, who are community? Like, who is community? When we define that, which voices get to be highlighted? And I think the challenge is that equity is not about the loudest voices or majority wins. And so many times when we hold public forums, it becomes about who had the most people on the call, or who had the most people in the audience, or who was the loudest, or who shut the meeting down. And a lot of times the folks who are most impacted by the decisions that we're going to make are not in the room. You know why? They don't know that there's a room. They don't know that there's a meeting. They're not connected in that way. And I think that that is
that is the real challenge, right? Like, and that is something that San Francisco is less than 6% African-American, and yet the decisions that are being made by folks that are not Black, right, are impacting Black people. And so I think we've got to figure out what outreach and engagement looks like. We have to really figure out how to center the voices of folks who are so disheartened, who are so disconnected, but also feel a sense of hopelessness. So as we do this work, what I'm really trying to be mindful of is that, yes, there's the research, and yes, there is the history, but there is also the hurt and the harm, not just that's been recorded, but that is still being perpetrated, right? That we have to address, and we have to understand when we go into these meetings, how to deal with that harm, the trauma, and the terror that has been passed down. And so I did appreciate in previous conversations that we have, and hopefully that'll come up today, what it is that we're doing when we do these meetings that are re-traumatizing, to heal people in that space, or to not hold a therapy session essentially, and then send people back out into the world with open wounds. And so as we do this work to address the humanity of folks, that we realize that there is a certain level of harm, to rehumanize folks and realize that that's going to cause some pain. And if we don't address it, then we're continuing to advance the harm that we're trying to stop.
I'll just briefly pick up where Cheryl left off in terms of the harm. What is unfortunate to me, it's a necessary reality, but what was unfortunate to me is that we are asking the traumatized to make the case for being traumatized, and while being traumatized. And it's very unfortunate, but it's part of our reality. The San Francisco Reparations Advisory Committee is similarly charged, like California Task Force, with measuring the harm perpetrated by the local municipality and then proposing redress and repair. It's really that basic. And so we are working hard to engage community in very similar ways that California Task Force has embarked upon, working towards kind of the benchmarks of a December 2022 draft report and a June 2023 final proposal of redress to the Board of Supervisors. And so the two things rather that I would just lift up quickly. One is that I hold a perspective that centuries of harm and destruction, genocidal destruction of Black bodies, Black lives, Black promise should be met with centuries of repair. And so it should be vast and wide and extend decades and generations. And so against that backdrop, there is federal kind of the federal level is complicit, state level is complicit, and certainly local municipalities are complicit. Even if they weren't the original perpetrators, they have been complicit in perpetuating continued harm and destruction. And so we're trying to play our part in the local context to bring that level of accountability. And the last thing I'll say in this moment is all of this, as it always has, sits in a political context. We were stood up as a committee in the height and heat of the global uprising following George Floyd's murder. And so, and I say this lovingly, it was easy for the Board of Supervisors to declare this was important to do. I appreciate it. It was unanimous. It was fantastic. There will be a very different conversation, I believe, in June of 2023, when we're faced with the actual opportunities for redress and repair and all of those implications. And so I think it's important to keep in mind as we do all of this necessary and important work that we are at the same time building a movement of sorts that is about creating civic will leading to political will to actually do something on the other side. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you very much, Cheryl and Eric, for those wonderful reflections. And to close us out with these introductory remarks, Fania, please tell us about the San Francisco Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission and the work that you are doing there and the goals that you have for this commission.
Thank you so much, Justin. And thank you to the Divided Communities Project and all of the sponsors of it. And thank you to Stanford for hosting this wonderful panel. And thank you to the panelists. I'm learning a lot. And as Justin said earlier, this is a larger part of a larger initiative, the San Francisco Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, by the National Grassroots Law Project to reckon with systemic harm against Black people in the cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. And also, as Justin said, even though the district attorneys are leading the efforts in those other two cities, we made a very intentional and deliberate decision that it would not be a systems-led, it would not be a government-led project. Of course, government would participate, but government would power share, as Justin said earlier, with community. And I think this is really important, and I want to discuss it a little bit in my 2.5 minutes that I have left. It's important, I think, that communities lead these processes because systems are the ones that have caused the harm in the first place. Not that systems should be excluded, but we need reimagining. We need new ideas. If we allow hierarchies to dominate these processes, then we will only replicate hierarchy. If we allow systems of domination to dominate these processes, then that's what we will get more of. As Albert Einstein said, you cannot solve a problem with the same thinking that it was created with. So that's why we are very, very principled and clear about this question of community leadership at every step of the way. So we have convened a community design team of Black people who are working in San Francisco in the gun violence movement and justice, safety, and public health, and youth development and mental health. And Cheryl has just been really incredible, an incredible ally in helping us to create this design team. And the next step, now that we've decided what we're focusing on and what the scope will be, we'll be looking at basically disinvestment and Black disappearance, from 1970 to 22. There were 13% Black people in San Francisco in 1970, and as of today, 5 to 6. And if the trend continues, there will be no Black people. So that, what was it called? The last Black man in San Francisco? There's some real data under that, and we're going to explore that. Before I conclude, because I know that we are very, very short on time, I want to just take a moment to look at the larger context that we're in. This is an amazing time. After Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, I wrote a lot about the need for truth and reconciliation processes because our justice system would not really be able to meet the moment and meet the need to stop these killings. And so I talked about truth and reconciliation processes. Back then, maybe a few people were also calling for these processes. But today, these processes are mushrooming throughout the nation. They're bubbling up. And I think the Transitional Justice, U.S. Transitional Justice Organization has found that, oh, that's my timer. Sorry. Has found that almost 100 government-led transitional justice initiatives exist in this country. And that does not include the ones that are community-led. In addition, I understand that there's hundreds of reparations projects happening in localities, I think 200 last count. And then you see at universities these amazing truth and repair and reckoning initiatives. There's an organization called the University Studying Slavery. It's just amazing these times that we're in and how quickly all of this happened. There's so much more to say. Very quickly, Restorative justice means that during these processes, we recognize the harm, we unearth and publicize hidden truths. We take responsibility for the harm, and that means pressing for public apologies and acknowledgements. 3, we make reparations for harm, restitution, reparations funds, memorialization to honor victims, and reparations that are commensurate with the harm that was caused. And 4th, take action to prevent recurrence. Those are the 4 R's of restorative justice: accountability. Very different from our attributive justice system's notion of accountability. And so we are following these notions of accountability in the San Francisco Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Project. And the other thing I want to say is that everything that we do, we want to be aware of healing. Our country was born in the birth traumas of slavery, the slave trade, genocide, land theft, heteropatriarchy, colonialism. We are a massive monument to harm. And that harm continues because we have buried those truths about who we are. And so they have perpetually reenacted themselves. That's what happens with trauma. If you don't face those truths and make an attempt to heal them, they will perpetually reenact themselves. And so the great thing today is that we are beginning to awaken. We're beginning to realize the need for repair, and we are beginning to realize the need to reimagine these systems so that there will be no recurrence of these harms.
Sonia, thank you so much for that insightful and poignant commentary. At this point, I'm going to ask a few questions directed at particular members of the group, but feel free all to step in as you feel appropriate, because I want this to be a dialogue. And my first question is actually going back to Fania. So Fania, you mentioned, the proliferation of these truth and reconciliation commissions that are largely government controlled and hierarchical. And in my experience, my limited experience, albeit, of the truth and reconciliation commissions in history, they generally come off of the ebb of one regime moving into another. And the work that we're talking about at the moment is governments and communities picking up the work of truth and reconciliation, dealing with this reconciliation work and kind of having to maintain their legitimacy over the communities after. And I guess in your work with these commissions internationally and domestically, I guess I wanted to ask about what might be the differences between the sort of regime change model and the continuous regime model, and how that might frustrate some of the work, and how that might have legitimacy implications as well.
Mm-hmm. I'll try to be brief here, but in South Africa, we had a truth and reconciliation process that was a transitional transitional justice process. In other words, the government there was transitioning from a period of apartheid and massive human rights abuse to a period of more sort of Western style democracy, we might say, under the leadership of Nelson Mandela. And so we had a government-led process. It was initiated by legislation, by the president, and it was led by community people, psychologists, experts, Desmond Tutu, and it was really important. This is very complicated, so it's hard to say in just a few words. The great thing about that commission was that it, for the first time, gave a microphone to victims of apartheid to share their stories, which people had never really heard before, at least not on the scale that we were able to hear during the Truth and Reconciliation process. And so a lot of gains were made on psychosocial levels in terms of reconciliation. However, of course, the biggest criticism is that no reparations. Reparations was recommended, but they were never actually implemented by the government. So the apartheid economic system is still in place today. Who owns the land? Who owns the businesses? So that's kind of that's one example. Today, I think that in this country, it would be a mistake to rely totally on government leadership, simply as I said earlier, because our systems were designed to subjugate people of color. They were designed to oppress, and they continue to oppress. And so we can't have that kind of a leadership in these processes if they're going to truly be transformational. Now, does that mean that the work that Don and Cheryl are doing is of no import? Of course not. And I love, though, what Cheryl talked about when she said that she was doing this listening campaign and really engaging and mobilizing the community. I think the more we do that, the more of a meaningful and effective and transformative process we'll have.
Thank you, Fania. I guess I'll move to Cheryl and Dawn at this point to talk about the California Task Force. And my question is, to what degree is the task force drawing from other precedents in California, particularly related to the history of Japanese internment, Dawn, which I know you're very well steeped in, and are there limitations there? And yeah, I would just love to hear kind of about the extent to which you're drawing on things that have already been done versus kind of creating new things based off of contemporary research.
I'll answer briefly and then punt to Cheryl. So the modern day example is Japanese American Redress and Reparations in 1981, in which by 1992, checks were issued to surviving persons of victims of the concentration camps during World War II. Out of 120,000 who were incarcerated, maybe less than half received checks. The compensation, it's called reparations, but it really, I mean, the losses of property, not to mention trauma, loss of life, were well beyond that. And that number was strictly arbitrary. It wasn't calculated on any specific number. There's no equivalence, obviously, between what happened to Japanese Americans and 400 years of anti-Black hatred and oppression. So some of that it's just not applicable. I mean, the scope of the harm is astronomical. We heard an economist yesterday in the public hearing, estimated that if you take modern day numbers, updated to present value, and you actually compensate for stolen wages, stolen bodies, stolen opportunities, stolen land, you're into $20 trillion. I mean, it is hugely enormous. And I'm with you, Eric, on your discussion that something that of that scale has to be matched with something of equal duration and massive scale too. So we're just beginning to unpack this issue. That's part 2 of the analysis. And ultimately, this is has to be a national remedy. What is starting here locally and in the state ultimately has to be pushed up through organizing and social consciousness and changing hearts and minds to the national level. This is a congressional responsibility. But California not only was complicit, but an active actor in what's happened here. And what we're uncovering is some of the stuff in connection with the redlining was as bad and worse than the consequences in the South. But let me turn it over to Cheryl and let her take it from here.
Thanks, Dawn. I'll simply add that I think that one of the things that we accomplish in the hearings just yesterday, the last 2 days, was looking back at the history of reparations efforts in this country as they relate to Black folks, and learning some of the work of the pioneers of this effort, going all the way back to the enslavement period, but also in more recent times in terms of the work of NCOBRA and NARC, NARC being the National African American Reparations Coalition Commission, and then COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. I think the other thing, though, is that if I modified your question just a smidge and said, you know, what are we doing to try to align with other folks, there are efforts going on, as Cheryl Davis mentioned, in other parts of the state at a more local level. And so in the instance, there was the city of San Francisco. Alameda County is doing something. Los Angeles City is doing something, has a commission. And so what we have tried to do is to make sure that we are in communication with all of the efforts in the state so that we can maximize each other's efforts, right? It's a win-win situation, both in terms of the listening sessions as well as the fact-finding. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Cheryl. Kusla, we have a question from the audience for you. So this person says, you noted the distinction between the 109 federally recognized tribes and the more than 170 tribes in California. How has this issue of this discrepancy surfaced on the commission, potentially caused tension and created obstacles for the work?
Trying to get me to go there. Okay, so this is a really good question. So there are 109 federally recognized tribes. Those 18 treaties that I mentioned previously, right, that weren't ratified, the usual way for becoming federally recognized, if we're looking at the history from moving East Coast to West, which is again a very biased kind of historical perspective, but whatever, let's take it from there. That's how you got federally recognized, was signing a treaty that was ratified by the federal government. So in this case, right, those, all of the signatory tribes, unless they were in some way, shape, or form, became federally recognized after, right, through some other executive act or congressional legislation, or going through the process, the federal recognition process, were never recognized. So that's a huge number of tribes that signed treaties that are not federally recognized today. Moreover, right, California is a village-based, right, most tribes in California are village-based communities. So we don't necessarily, not all of us have massive tribes. For example, I'm Chumash. I don't use the term Chumash Nation, right? Because to me, there's not a nation of Chumash that goes from one place to another. We are village-based peoples. So I can document my ancestry to a specific village in a specific location, right? So that's really important, because when we talk about Indigenous communities, we have to talk about specific Indigenous communities, right? We can't allow that term to gloss over the actual California Native people from that area. And I think Cheryl Davis was alluding to that earlier when talking about working with American Indians here in San Francisco, right? There's urban American Indians. They aren't necessarily all California Indians, right? Which is what we're talking about when we're talking about the California Truth and Healing Council. And so where are the Ramaytush in that conversation, right? So, and they're the unfederally recognized group at play in San Francisco. So it gets really complicated. It gets even more complicated, of course, within the Truth and Healing Council. Each region has a federally recognized member as well as an unrecognized member. So the federally recognized members do outnumber the unrecognized members on the council. You know, how many tribes are on the California Native American list that are not federally recognized? How many of those, you know, that number changes. The state is currently trying to redo its own criteria for who should be on that list. So it's not just an issue that the council is facing, it's actually one of the many continuing harms that the state itself is perpetuating, which is how do we determine who is a California Indian and what constitutes a tribe? So it's a really important question. It's a really complicated one. But yes, it's an issue that is coming up.
Thank you for shedding some light on that. This next question I want to direct at Eric. Eric, you mentioned earlier when the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, was gathering to do something around George Floyd, that was pretty easy, right? That was very much in your face, kind of hard not to respond in that moment. But then you also alluded that, you're going to be doing this work as part of the subcommittee or the committee. And when you come to them with your conclusions, you don't expect that it'll be quite as easy. And I just wanted to get your take on the reality, the political dynamics surrounding the issue of reparations and the implications of adopting, the recommendations that any of you might propose as part of the work that you're doing, and how that will play out in your.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate the question. I will go back to the federal level first and just set as a context. For over 30 years, Representative Conyers brought a study bill to the floor that they would not pass. Just a study bill. It wasn't a proposal for reparations. It was just a study. They said no. And we still haven't passed HR 40, even in its new incarnation. And so that work is happening. So again, it's this political context. And as you referenced, locally here in San Francisco, it was at the height. And again, I applaud our supervisors for, seizing the moment, so to speak, and creating this opportunity. However, what is also true at every level of these conversations is that immediately on passage, everything from it's an advisory, not a decision-making body, or what are the parameters? We want to limit, kind of contain the ways in which we will provide redress or repair. We want to make sure we know exactly every single person, by name, rank, and serial number, what they're supposed to receive or not. We want to make sure we don't give someone something they are not due. And I believe that that's a kind of a dog whisper, so to speak, of we really don't want to do this. We'll do it to the extent that we are forced to do so, but we only want to do it at a minimal level, which is why I hold a context of centuries of harm, centuries of repair, commensurate with said harm. And so I think that's our political reality. San Francisco, champions its own progressive posture. And yet I believe we're going to experience the reality that when we come forward and say, and I'm making this up, we're nowhere near recommendations yet, but when we say the Fillmore should be given back to the Black community, that's not going to be an easily held, embraced, or enacted piece of work. And all of this will also sit in the context of a legal reality that we expect that almost everything we propose at some level to be litigated. And so we've got to pass through each of these kind of hoops, so to speak, just to make the case for what I believe is clear, and many of us believe is very clear, demonstrable harm. And yet that's the political reality. So I think it will be important, as I said earlier, all along this path and at every level to continue to build civic will that will hopefully lead to political will to actually take action. And so it'll be interesting what June 2023 looks like in San Francisco.
Thank you, Eric. Kind of focusing on San Francisco, and this question is kind of for any of the San Francisco involved folks, kind of dovetailing off that question of political will and political realities. I think somebody mentioned, I guess a couple of you mentioned that San Francisco is only less than 66% Black at this point. But it shouldn't be lost that San Francisco has a wealth of Black leadership for a city that only has 6% Black people. The mayor of San Francisco is Black, the chief of police is Black, the president of the board of supervisors is Black, the director of the Human Rights Commission, the chief of the adult probation department. And I guess an audience attendee wants to ask, how is the Black leadership in San Francisco being leveraged to accomplish these gains for Black people as far as reparations and law enforcement and policing reform and these things that we know are real harms to Black people? And is that being used to accelerate the pace of the work, or are we still facing these really tough political realities and not really getting much support from leadership in that regard?
So I'll jump in there. There are a couple of things off the top that I would say. It's interesting because right now I've been really struggling with the fact that I believe that disproportionate amount of Black leadership in San Francisco is experiencing some of what we talked about America what America did at the conclusion of the Obama administration, right? Like the idea of a blacklash. I think that there is the intent to create policies and so things that I think are meant to handcuff the mayor or Black leadership for doing things that are viewed as corruption and other things that may or may not be happening with other folks that worked for the city or did not work for the city. But the idea that those things just started happening when Black people got into leadership is what I struggle with, right? That all of a sudden there's a sense of urgency to manage and make sure that city government operates in a certain kind of way. And what I feel that is that it's really about, it's fine when other folks do it, when the fact that somebody Black in leadership might do that, not that they even do it, but that they potentially might, let's make sure that we end that. And so what I'm feeling a lot of right now is that folks think just because you are in leadership that you get to actually do something, right? Like that it's not quite as simple as the title. And so part of this is, that's why community voice is so important. That's why community gathering is so important. That is why, to Eric's point, the movement that happened in 2020, and Fania mentioned this as well, isn't because all of a sudden people had a conscience, right? It's because the masses were protesting, because folks were marching, because it seemed like, oh, this isn't just a Black issue and it's not just Black voices anymore. So part of the challenge in navigating this is that we are very fortunate in San Francisco that during that crisis and when everybody was saying, you know what, we should allocate more funds and we should put money towards this, that the Board of Supervisors president and the mayor actually said, let's put $60 million a year, let's put it in the budget, let's annualize it for the Black community. And it wasn't without challenge, but they did that at a time when we're hearing that other people made promises to put money that never materialized to support Black movements, to support Black lives, and they did. And so we're in the process of moving that money. The other thing that's happening is that we are leveraging those dollars to advance systems change, right? And so one of those things was that the down payment assistance program that was created for Black folks gave more money than any other down payment assistance program. So that was a change, because now all of the down payment assistance programs give the same amount that was leveraged for that group and that money rollout, right? Same thing with the grant making process, where we've seen in the past that community didn't get to weigh in and that the process is so bureaucratic that it actually keeps out struggling businesses or organizations. And so there's a lot of learning that's happening there. I would say the other piece is, there was an article that, well, not even an article, several articles that came out when we talked about some real reform for like guaranteed income for folks who had been involved or likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. The mayor took like a real beating on that. I got like the most ridiculous emails and threats for even thinking about giving somebody who was a criminal money to kind of help keep them as a part of the process for justice reform. And no one stepped up to say that this is a good idea or to help or to support. And it becomes really hard to do this work as a leader when community doesn't support it. So leadership can only go so far, because at some point community will either say we don't agree or they stand and silence sometimes is support. So this piece around like, what is leadership doing to leverage? A lot of times it's able to leverage community momentum better than it is to leverage the title of leadership. So I try to walk lockstep with community so that it's easier to actually not be pushing my agenda, but to actually be making sure to push what community wants to see happen.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Fania, I guess I was wondering if you might have any thoughts on that, especially as it relates to the community piece, as I know that that's very important to you. Oh, you're muted, Fania.
Sorry about that. I don't have that much to add to what Cheryl has said, especially her specific comments about leadership in San Francisco. But of course, it very much resonates with my views on community organizing, on how change occurs in modern day societies like ours. And it also sort of affirms to me that, when you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have occurred over the last 45 years that have been very top-down and government-dominated, expert-dominated, that's not going to work for us. We need truth, healing, reconciliation, justice movements in this country. And so that it would trickle up sort of. I'm not trying to say that federal government shouldn't be held accountable. Of course they need to be held accountable. The massive changes that are needed can only be done with the cooperation of government. It's just, I'm just so passionate about the central role of community. And one other comment I wanted to make, international standards of reparations require guarantees of non-recurrence. So that means it's important, all of us who are doing this truth and reconciliation work, the reparations work generally, that we not only unearth truths, and that we not only repair, and that's very problematic, of course. How do you quantify repair? Who gets it and all of that? But an even more challenging or just as challenging requirement is to guarantee non-recurrence. What do we need to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Not just slavery, not just genocide, but their legacies, their present day legacies. How do we stop that? How do we stop the killings? And I think we aren't looking at that part of reparations enough in our movements today all across the country. We're focused a lot on repair, which is wonderful. We're focused a lot on truth, which is absolutely necessary. And it's important that we focus on what changes are needed. How do we reimagine education and policing and health and all of our systems to prevent recurrence of all of these harms that have been bedeviling us for centuries.
Thank you so much, Fania. I have one more question for anyone in the group who wants to take it before we move into final remarks. And that is, we've been talking a lot about redress, particularly from the government. But a couple people in the audience have asked about the private sector's role in all this and whether any of your initiatives might be eyeballing the private sector and what their responsibility might be in this landscape as we consider reparations and identifying harms. And would love your thoughts on that.
I'll just jump in briefly and quickly to say that absolutely appreciate that question and that focus. I would just kind of anchor that it's not in the kind of purview of the committee to, bring some accountability. That said, we do have intentions of inviting those, as we talk about our community engagement, inviting them into the conversation. There certainly are perpetrators in all sectors that and against which and with whom there should be some accountability. And I think collectively, there's an opportunity and challenge for us to determine how to bring that kind of leverage into the equation. Because I believe that we find it in corporate, we find it in philanthropies, we find it again across sectors where the harm has been perpetrated and continues to be perpetrated. So I do think that there is a place for accountability there.
If I can jump in here too, and perhaps say the two quick things. One, there's a model up in Alaska that I thought was really insightful. We talked about it at a side event for the UN Permanent Forum. And one of the things that came out of it was that in their truth and reconciliation processes, they actually have partners, right, participating. So in that case, it's non-native partners who are basically almost like liaisons to the community. So they could be from NGOs or other leadership orgs in the region that basically sit in and listen, right? So that's kind of what frustrates me, to be quite honest, right, about this model, the government model, is that we are California Indians going out to talk to other California Indians, re-traumatizing everybody in the process, right? And then, like, the people we really need to be telling these stories to are the elected officials from that region, right? Or whomever else, right? Getting the buy-in from we know these stories, right? I think we all kind of have heard this, like we know a lot of the history, maybe not all of it, but enough to make an imprint. What we really need are those partners at the table that don't know it and that can then go out and help lead that change and help be advocates, right? Who are sitting in community with us during these processes. So that's something that I thought from Alaska was an interesting perspective, and that's open to kind of private sector, NGOs, and so forth. And then, again, on the equity thing that I was mentioning earlier, right? I really do have a very different kind of way of thinking about equity, because all of the land that was stolen, right? There's these Silicon Valley, you've got ag land, you've got all this stuff in California that has grown out of that. And so what is it, what can those entities that have profited in that way, whether we're talking about, the Levi Strauss, families and what have you, what of this wealth that's been generated, what is their obligation? What is their commitment to making sure that they're paying it back in some way, shape, or form? So if we take these questions seriously, and that's a question internally, right? So if a private sector entity actually wants to engage in these kinds of conversations, what does that look like? Well, from my perspective, that includes reaching out to the Indigenous community that they are geographically located in or wherever their headquarters were, right? Trying to start learning about their own history and having their own internal reckoning, right? With what their history is as an organization. And then working with those Indigenous partners to kind of say, okay, what, do we want to bring you on an advisory capacity? What do you want from us? What can we provide for you? Is it support for your students or education program, like whatever it is? But there's a lot of different ways that we can envision that. We just need people who are willing to have that conversation, right? And to start building those bridges.
Absolutely, Kusa. Thank you so much. Well, at this point, everyone, we are nearing the end. Thank you so much for being a part of this really amazing conversation. I'm sure it has left the audience with a lot to think about. And I'm sure they're all curious as to how they can get involved and support the work of each of your initiatives. I'd like to close out by going around to each and every one of you and maybe just asking a bit for you to speak very succinctly on the role of healing in your work. And how we can achieve greater healing through this process. And so I'll start with Dawn on that.
Well, the answer is of every broad social movement and social change is changing hearts and minds. That's where everything begins. I want to echo what Fanyu and other people have said. So I think part of that for the state process is the shining of the light thing. And the last government report that came out, 1968 Kerner Commission report, which kind of connected the dots and certainly predicted accurately what would be the outcome if there was not serious intervention. And now we're in it. And I think the report that's coming out in June is 600 pages, much more comprehensive, and talk about private government cooperation in the oppression, from insurance companies to housing to redlining to tech companies with algorithms, which are the modern day equivalents of the redlining maps. All of those things we need to get into and shine a light on. So that's part of that process that we're working on.
Thank you, John. Eric.
Thanks, Justin. I think I'm going to get in line behind Fania because what she laid out in terms of truth and reconciliation is ultimately what leads to healing, I believe. So I subscribe to all that Fania has continued to lift up for us in that regard, culminating with, not culminating, but inclusive of the repair. That it's difficult to achieve full healing, in my view, unless and until there's the truth telling, the reconciliation, and the repair. And so all are necessary, in my view, for us to reach that kind of ultimate place of healing.
Thank you, Eric. Cheryl Grills.
Oh, sorry about that. So for me, I think since Cheryl Davis invoked Ella Baker, I'm going to quote Ella Baker. And she said, in order to see where we are going, we not only must remember where we have been, but we must understand where we have been. And to put it in Baldwin's words, we can't heal what we won't face. So this process is not an intellectual exercise. Ultimately, it is a healing of our minds, our bodies, and our spirits, all the way down to our very souls. And so we in the Association of Black Psychologists and the Community Healing Network will be including supports at each of the listening sessions based on our Emotional Emancipation Circle's healing process that we have been delivering literally around the world.
Incredible. Kusla.
I mean, I guess I'll be honest, right? What else can I be? I'm not there yet. I don't know what healing looks like for this. I can say that there's a lot of things that we need, right? Land back, so on and so forth, but I don't know what healing looks like if I'm honest with you.
Cheryl Darius.
I'm like trying to take notes on all the things that are being like said here. The mention of the Kerner report reminded me. I've just been reading this book on Horace Tate, who said second-class integration is more evil than segregation, right? And so when you talk about the continuing harm and understanding and struggling with defining healing, I've often really wrestled with this idea of reparations, right, versus restoration, right? How do we get back to, how do we restore, how do we get back to whole? Because I think reparations focuses on repair. And, if we are just repairing the brokenness, right, like that broken leg is never quite as strong, right, as it was before the fracture. And so what does it look like for us to restore to whole, right? When we talk about truly healing, for me, that is getting back to whole, getting back to who we fully were. And this idea of healing for me means that this part of understanding where we come from, being able to be grounded in that, to understand the fullness of who we are. Often when folks talk about it in terms of African Americans talking about understanding you were kings and queens in the land that you came from, understanding the richness of the culture and the history and of the music. I think about Howard Thurman and James Cone and folks who talk about the music, the spirituals and the blues, and that it wasn't just about singing a song, it was about affirming humanity. So as we go through this, the idea of healing and restoration is about the affirming of your humanity, but you fully knowing your humanness, right? So when we talk about trauma, the trauma and the traumatizing that's happening to folks, it is the traumatization has not allowed us to be fully human, to not even see ourselves in that. The idea that someone put in the chat that we are still living and working with this colonized mind.
Yes.
Healing is getting to the place where we affirm our humanity, where we're not talking about imposter syndrome or whether we were the only one in the room, whether that is a woman, whether it's a person of color, whether that is all of that healing pieces that we don't walk into a room really trying to figure out why we don't belong in that room or why somebody doesn't think we belong in the room. So healing is that restoration and affirming our humanity, not just externally, but internally.
Thank you, Cheryl. And Fania, please close us out.
Oh, that was a beautiful close. And let's see what I can add. Wow. Okay. I think history is calling upon us to be healers. We are good at causing harm. As I said earlier, that's who we are as a nation, We cause harm to our bodies, our spirits, our minds, our children, our communities, our earth, our waters. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that we will not have a future until we learn ways of being present to one another that bring healing and wholeness. We are caught in a closed loop in this country of trauma. We can, and that's because we haven't faced the trauma, as James Baldwin was quoted earlier by Cheryl. We keep repeating it. That's what I said earlier as well. We abolished slavery, but the racial terror at the heart of slavery continued with convict leasing. We abolished convict leasing. That continued with debt slavery and with the chain gang. And then that was abolished, and that continued with the racial terror continued with Jim Crow and with lynching, and that was abolished. And the racial terror continued with mass incarceration, with police killings, and on and on and on. We have no future. We just have a repeating past. We have a Black president, but he is followed by the worst, most racist and conservative, retrogressive president ever in history. We have incredible demonstrations in May, in the summer of 2020, like never before. White people, 60% supporting Black Lives Matter. All kinds of gains. We are so hopeful like never before. That is followed by January 6th, by attacks on critical race theory. Every time we make an advance, there is the white lash, there is the pushback. And that's part of that repeating history, repeating racial terror, and being prisoners of history and hostages of time. And I believe that the only way we will ever disrupt this pattern is through healing, not just in some kind of vague, nice hand-holding way, but in a very rigorous way. How when we do these initiatives, how can we infuse healing and justice into them, in very thoughtful ways. And as was suggested earlier, when traumatized people share, and all of us are traumatized, we are a trauma nation, but when people share their stories, make sure someone is there to hold them and to comfort them. And let's just be really creative about how we can walk as healers in these times. And that's how we call forth a new future, by embodying those values now. Yeah, so.
A worthy charge, Fun, a worthy charge. Thank you all for participating today. This was so rewarding for me. As you can see in the audience comments, they are thanking you left and right for your words of wisdom and for the work you're doing. And so cannot thank you all enough for being present with us today. To the audience, we will be on this same link in about 10 minutes. So roughly 10:40, we'll be back here to start the second panel. So please come back for that. And again, panelists, thank you for being here. Thank you to Stanford for hosting this session. And yeah, take care, everybody, and have a wonderful morning.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.